Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the FCC for this lunch. My name is Florence de Changy. I'm the president of the club and the correspondent for Le Monde and the French National Radio. And delighted to be the host today. I'm sorry for the people who are standing behind. I think we could have filled a much bigger room, but you must have replied too late, and then we decided the small room, and we could have gone in the big room. But anyway, we'll make the most of it, and it's great to have a packed room to listen to HS Liu. Before I get to today, I'll briefly let you know that Wednesday evening, we're hosting a very interesting documentary called We Have Boots by Ullens Chan. He's revisiting he's revisiting basically the umbrella movement. We already hosted Evan Chan previously, and we'll show this movie downstairs at Birds, and he will be there to answer questions afterwards. Now to today's event. Very delighted to have with us lifetime member of the FCC and Pulitzer Prize winner, fantastic photographer Liu Heung Shing, but you're called HS more, right, Mr. Liu, and Phil Tinari. I'll quickly read you through what Liu did. Basically, he's had multiple assignments through Asia, and he's been a witness to many important events that marked the last decades of the 20th century. More specifically, what happened in Russia and then what happened in China. Liu was recognized best photographer by the Associated Press in '89 and in '91. In '92, he shared with his colleagues in Moscow a Pulitzer Prize for spot news photography for documenting the collapse of the Soviet Union. Liu is the author of several great books. The latest one we're going to see a short video of. Previous one that was introduced here as well was published by Taschen 10 years ago. And to entertain Liu in a conversation after we watch the brief video, we have Phil Tinari, who is the director of the UCCA Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, which is, you probably know, one of China's leading institutions of contemporary art. Philip is a contributing editor of Art Forum. He has launched the magazine Chinese edition in 2008. He was also co-curator of the exhibition on art and China after 1889. So yes, we're basically in excellent company to have this dialogue. I will play the video now, and then we will start the conversation. But please welcome our two great guests for today. fascinating pictures. I know they say that one picture is worth 1,000 words, but I would still love you to comment on every single one of them. So, but anyway, Philippe, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much.
You just press this and yeah.
Thank you so much for having us here, and I just want to say what an honor it is to be in conversation with HS, who I think is a man who certainly shaped, I was not present at many of these the early moments of the reform era in China, and I think for so many of us, these iconic images of this incredibly optimistic period in China's history are really, that moment is represented in your work kind of more than anywhere else. When we think, your sort of mental B-roll of China starting to open up, it's probably 80% of mine is images from HS's work over these many years. And I just wanted to start by saying, it's the context for this talk today is that we're actually at the end of this long art week that now happens in Hong Kong this time of the year. And as we saw from some of these images, HS has been a photographer, a photojournalist, but is also now present in a new way as kind of an artist. And of course, someone who's been observing art among the many other things he's been observing for all this period. So it's sort of in terms of framing one of the dynamics I think we'll be exploring. But I did want to start just by sort of asking you to give us a really, I'm sure some people know this already, but just some background of how you came to do the work that you did, how growing up, becoming interested in photography, deciding to be a photojournalist, and finding your way into and out of and back to China over those early years.
First, I'd like to thank Florence being my host today. And I have spent a lot of time in this premise, including shortly after Tiananmen 1989. I went, after I was born in Hong Kong, to the mainland because of my mainland parents. And little would I understand what I saw, what I experienced in Fuzhou would get me interested in China till now, and I'm sure in the years to come. One of the things that in life that you don't know where to draw the dots. But for me, the death of Mao was certainly a milestone. I was in Paris when I saw every newsstand, every French newspaper had a front page, full page photographs of Mao. I knew Mao had died, and I went to China, hoping to cover the news. That was my first major assignment from Time magazine and for Stern magazine as well. I have to say I failed very badly in my first assignment. Not only did I not reach my destination in Beijing, which at the time I believe was gearing up to arrest a gang of 4, but accidentally, the week I spent strolling along the banks of the Pearl River, I discovered and I saw the Chinese with an entire new set of body languages. Then I remember as a child in Fuzhou. By that I meant soon after Mao's death, I noticed the faces of people in Guangzhou seemed more relaxed, their eyes less scrutinizing of visitors from abroad. Their steps seems easier, and they walk seems freer. I knew then that if I had a chance to come back to China as a photojournalist, then I would try to capture China after Mao. And this is what I did when Time magazine sent me, along with writer Richard Bernstein, to open the bureau in Beijing. Actually in 1978, before the renormalization that took place on January 1st, 1979. And from 1978 to 1983, till now, I believe my photographs would show it was China's second enlightenment. By that I mean, since 1949, since the Great Leap Forward, since the Cultural Revolution, China that I discovered in 1978 had never been freer. Eight of the American journalists arrived in Beijing together with our other Western colleagues. We would go to visit the Democracy Wall 3-4 times a day. We would see millions of Chinese pouring into Beijing to petition to the central government against and express their grievances of the sufferings they experienced during the Cultural Revolution. And at the same time, Chinese peasants were beginning to assume responsibility of their own land, and writers, feminist writer Zhang Jie would start writing about their books, issues of Chinese women from the feminist point of view. Investigative journalist Liu Heung Shing will begin writing wounded literatures. Famed Beijing opera singer would resign and leave the official troupe to start her own. Official publishing house with their own state budget would start translating books from abroad, including political theory, philosophy, literature, arts. This is also the year that marked the 40th anniversary of Star Group, of Chinese artists demanding freedom for art. So this would go on. Democracy Wall would move from Xidan to the Ritang Park. What I saw was the changes I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting change would be so sweeping. And I believe when I leave the assignment in 1983 to go to Los Angeles and California, I had not anticipate that I would return to China in 1989 in the thick of students' hunger strike in Tiananmen Square. And I have since also returned to live in Beijing since 1997. So in 40 years, many friends and colleagues ask me, what do I think about China? My belief is that if we wanted to get to understand China a little bit better, I think it's imperative that we understand what happened to China in the first 35 years to understand better the astonishing speed that China changed in the second 35 years.
Well, I'd love to talk a little bit about your position as a photographer and your kind of artistic vision and outlook. There's the subject matter and the people and the incidents and the things, the decisive moments that you photographed along the way. But I think beneath all of that, there's a fundamental understanding of what photography is, what it can do, how it functions as an art form. So I'd love to hear a bit from a more almost aesthetic perspective about how you approach your medium.
I believe there's something fundamentally different to photography than other art forms. And there's something about photography, there's something about how camera functions, and that defines photography two of its exclusivity compared to sculptors, compared to artists with a paintbrush and so on. And that is the aperture of the camera and the shutter speed. Because the combination of these two things make photography stands out, and in many ways force the modern art, the art eventually to evolve and change to what we see now. I may take a moment to look at to remind us from the video clip that you saw. For example, I like to cite two examples of what I meant that photography is different than other art forms. When you see the Chinese students allowed to take examination for university, which was suspended throughout 10 years of Cultural Revolution, I find myself walking past the Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese young women students, they cannot study at home because there was very little electricity and light. So they went to the Tiananmen Square, and for me as a photographer, I said, well, I really like to get to see the full view of the Tiananmen Square, for which I would need a lot of depth of field to photograph the girls, their faces, their postures, all the way to the martyrs, monuments of martyrs, and the Mao's mausoleum. And I took out my light meter. In order to do that, the light meter didn't tell me how much light there was there and how do I expose. So I took a calculated guess. I took my camera, my little Leica, and placed it in front of these girls. And I was on the floor, and I set the aperture f22 because I wanted to get the depth of field. So I pressed B shutter. And I don't know how long it would take to expose this frame. So I counted manually in my mind of 23 seconds to expose that pictures. And the other picture you might see is the resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev. That day, for example, I was in the afternoon in Moscow. I took a call on my mobile phone from the gentleman who's the chairman of Turner Broadcast and the head of CNN, Mr. Tom Johnson. Tom said, "HS, what did you do this evening?" I said, "What's going on?" He said, "If you have nothing to do, I would like you to join me." I said, "Okay." So at 7 p.m., I entered the Spassky Gate in the Red Square, the gates to the Kremlin. Only when I reached the room inside the Kremlin, did I realize that Gorbachev actually made a deal with CNN, that CNN would be the first network to broadcast, to have an interview with him when he would resign from the post of General Secretary of Soviet Communist Party and the President of Soviet Union. But it was a live telecast, and and I saw the Soviet video camera, the size of the half size of this table, very old-fashioned, and therefore the tripod also was enormous. I said, "Oh, the best position for me would be to sit in front of the tripod, looking at Gorbachev." As soon as I squat down at the tripod, the KGB bodyguard of Gorbachev said to me, "Please do not take pictures," because I think he asked a legitimate request. He said, "Your shutter would interfere of this live telecast of this very important speech." I said, "Fair enough," and I sat down. But as Gorbachev started to deliver the speech, I said, "No, I'm not going to honor this request." I thought about 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution that started this whole thing. I thought the history is going to end in front of my eyes. What should I do? And I thought, perhaps I had one and only opportunity, and that is to capture when he tossed the speech down. But to do that, if I use any other shutter speed, the picture may look like a regular press conference picture, to tell you honestly. So I said, I would take a gamble. But this is a very calculated gamble, because I remember in the days I spent in Europe, in France, visiting this church and cathedrals, I often forced myself to do pictures of 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second, to get the depth of field to see the church. So I would say I'm pretty steady with my hands. But so I thought 30 of a second, I could show the speech actually moving. And as he finished, he threw the speech down. I took one frame. That was a gamble, because at 30 of a second, there is no guarantee that Gorbachev will be sharp. So I took the frame, the only frame. Right after that frame, the KGB guard threw me a punch behind the tripod. And my eyes, I saw Tom Johnson standing on the left side of Gorbachev. He looked at me with his eyes, asking questions like I look at you now. Are you okay? And I nodded my head. And Tom Johnson reached into his pocket and took out his Mont Blanc pen and gave it to Gorbachev to sign his resignation. And after that, I get up and I run down the hall. It's a long corridor, just like this lunch table, but much longer hallway in the Kremlin. As I turned the corner, hundreds of other Western journalists knew something was wrong. How come HS running out by himself? So subconsciously, they all raised their hand and give me their middle fingers. I ignore them and I run to my car in the Red Square. The next day, of course, the Gorbachev was sharp, and the speech was moving, and I believe every newspaper editor saw the paper, and that picture would front virtually all the front page. So, in a roundabout way, with photographs, I like to point out why photography is as an art form is something is unique about it.
It's a wonderful meditation on photography and its many valences. I think it's quite interesting to keep on this thread of talking about specific images, and there's another one from another moment that I think is formational in many of our lives and careers. Of course, June 4th, 1989. You didn't take the Tank Man photo, but the other two most famous photos of that moment, one would be the students accompanying the wounded protesters on the back of the three-wheeled tricycle to the hospital, and then on the way in was talking with another guest here about the one of the couple on the bicycle, almost weighed down by these tanks above them on the traffic overpass. I think there's just so much to unpack in an image like that. The first photograph that I just mentioned was later made into a painting by the Chinese artist Wang Xingwei that was collected by Uli Sig and later given to M+, and was made the cover of the collection book of when they started to tour this collection internationally, and finally when it came back to Hong Kong was not allowed to be on the cover of the book anymore. So anyway, I'd love to hear about those images as well.
Yeah. I think as a photographer, in many ways, we are given a set of tools that is not unlike the writers. As a foreign correspondent, you are given the trust by the paper or the organization that you work for. In many ways, a foreign correspondent at a post has unparalleled freedom to report, to photograph what we see, and the more local knowledge that you accumulate, I think the more it helps you to explain things to yourself first before you can explain it to your readers. In 1989, when I saw the statue, the Goddess of Democracy statue was transported in three sections made of styrofoams to be transported to Tiananmen Square, and the next day was unveiled with great fanfare. I knew something was going when I look at it at that time. I had the advantage of being able to talk to the CAFA students. So as they built a very large scaffolding, to install this Goddess of Democracy. So they allowed me to, the only one to go up to the top to take the pictures showing the face of the Goddess of Democracy. I want to do that because in the Tiananmen Square there were still the tents, the students' tents, where they had hunger strike, and I also want to have to come up with a photograph that sets the context of what's going on. The context was, this is Tiananmen Square, and there it was, the great hall of people, and here is the Goddess of Democracy, and so on. But after that day, some of my colleagues were wondering, maybe the story was petering out. And some have left, and including my editors from Tokyo, who had been there since the early part of May, and students and pictures would go on and on. He felt it's time for him to leave. I said to him, Jim, don't leave, because you have a situation here with a 100% symbol of American equivalent, the look of Statue of Liberty, which was given by France. And this statue was staring down the portrait of Mao in Tiananmen Square, where Mao had proclaimed the Chinese people had stood up and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. So for me, the intuitive feeling was very clear that the Chinese would not let this go on for very, very long. And so it happened. After what happened in the night of June 4th, New York called me because our editors left. Me and other photographers were just in Beijing to help out on this story. New York called me and said, HS, you are in charge. I said, no, I don't want to be in charge. I want to be taking pictures. He said, well, you're in charge and you can take pictures. Or basically, it meant that I'll be editing our reports, our images. And with that, New York called me the morning of the June 5th because of the time difference. Say, oh, now the sunlight is rising in Beijing. We would like to see photographs of the Tiananmen Square. And I look around our bureau, the room. I saw our photographer, Jeff Widener, because at that time, no one had any sleep. So he was lounging in our sofa. I say, Jeff, go down. Because I remember in the early 80s, late 70s, Beijing hotel is where everybody hang out. You have the diplomats, you have the incoming foreign businessmen, you have students. It's a place, the cafe in Beijing hotel is where everybody hang out. I said, so I said to Jeff, I said, it's already martial law has already been declared. So I said, you just, don't go with too many cameras. Maybe just one camera and one lens. Maybe you could take a 400 millimeter lens with a 2x doubler, which will give you an 800 millimeter range. I said, you could get pictures of Tiananmen Square. So about hour 45 minutes passed. Jeff called me, said, HS, I think I had these pictures. I'm not sure it was sharp. I understand why. He probably shot it with 800 millimeter lens handheld. He said, I had these pictures of the man in front of a row of tanks. And I said, interesting. Could you immediately roll up this roll of film and separate your film from the camera? And then come downstairs to the lobby and see if you can find a foreign student or someone willing to be your pigeon, to be the messenger. And you stay behind. And 45 minutes later, for those of you familiar with Beijing, Beijing Hotel is not that far from Qijiayuan diplomatic quarters. So 45 minutes later, an American young man, blonde, with a long pigtail and a backpack and an AP envelope. He said, "Is there a Mr. Liu here?" So I gave the packet to our Japanese photographer Mikami, and Mikami processed the film. And I saw the frame that you're now all very familiar with. And I write this caption and I press send. As soon as I send the pictures, the phone rang. And Jen Wang, the author of China Blue, who we met, I introduced her to Fox Butterfield, New York Times in the late 90s. By then, Jan was the bureau chief of Toronto Globe and Mail. And Jan called me, said, the tanks are on their way to you. And she hung up. And I knew what she meant, because the tanks coming on my way, meaning the tanks are going from Beijing Hotel to the east side, because, this is the only road the tanks can travel. So I get down to the building, get into my car, because I used to live in Jianguomenwai diplomatic quarters, so I knew my way. I have ample local knowledge, and I know which building would overlook the Chang'an Avenue. But by the time I get to that building, there was a wooden door blocking me to go to the rooftop. So I'm not really exactly a big guy, but with my little frame, I slammed down the door and I reached the roof. And just when I tried to breathe, I saw the pair of tanks was making a turn, and on top of the tank, the top open, also have two PLA soldiers with a helmet. And I looked under, there was this pair of young lovers on the bike, and I took the pictures. I rushed back, and then I put that pictures send it out. So the next day, the president of the Associated Press, Mr. Lou Bacardi, he used an old-fashioned cable and sent it to us. Say, hey, thank you guys. Today the AP owned the world. By that he meant Jeff Widener's picture is horizontal, and mine is vertical. So either you are broadsheets or a tabloid. There's no escaping of these two images.
Well done.
So it's all about formatting at the end of the day. I wanted to fast forward to the sort of last period covered in this book, which is actually similar to the first period, that early moment of reform, which is so beautifully covered in your exhibition in Beijing now, which is called Spring Wind. I think a beautiful poetic title. There was sort of another spring wind, I think, in the early 2000s. And you were in a different place in your life by this point. I think you can tell us a bit, but you left the front line of photojournalism. You were more you're a media executive and building inroads and connections in China, but you also used this position to take some really amazing photos of some of the defining personalities of that moment. People like Jiang Xin from Soho, or Fan Bingbing, the movie star, various other, even sort of normal people. There's one photo you have of these two ladies in a car with the top down, one of whom we all know she's the head of PR for Hermes for many, many years in Shanghai. I'd love to hear you a little bit about that moment. I'm much closer to where we are today, but I think still, actually, I feel that optimism might not be quite the same as it was.
And if I, as a timekeeper,
yeah, of course,
I can just remind you that we would like to finish around 2, as we always do, and it would be fantastic if we had time for some questions from the floor, and including from myself. So, yeah. Just if you can try.
I want to answer this quickly, because I think, as I said before, many of these rooms are writers and photographers also. The way you report a country, I think, especially these days, not one article would do, not a single image is enough to capture China. And I understand very well that writers need to have a series of story to build a narrative, to report with certain insight of what he or she feels, she understands the story. And I think photographers is the same. When I arrived in Beijing, China was clearly still a very collective society. there was no more people's commune, but the organization, the unit, the schools holds a file of everybody. Even to this day, that file goes wherever you go, to whatever jobs you take, there was a file on you. And when person today, when they leave the job, they will request the company or the organization to release to sign to release that file, so that person can go to transfer that file to another organization or company that he or she may apply for a job. But by 1997, when I came back, 94 and 97 in Hong Kong, and I went to Beijing, what I saw was clearly China had changed from a collective society to a very much a individualistic society. Individuals is the new language. So all those photographs you mentioned, I understand. I'm no longer 26 when I arrived in Beijing, so I cannot, and I was just founded this Shanghai Center of Photography. I could not do the kind of pictures that require me, to get on the plane, get on the train, with traveling with my satellite phone and so on. I can't do those things anymore. But what fascinates me is the idea of capturing individual through portraitures, because portraitures is another very important genre in photography. Portraitures can also report, and so in the video you just see from Ai Weiwei to business tycoon to a child had to walk 20 kilometers to go to school in the rain-soaked sneakers in Guizhou. It's a different way of looking. So despite I age, I feel I could still do photographs in a different way.
Great. So thank you very much for this. We have 10 minutes for question, and if you don't mind, I'll get the first one. Back to this idea of iconic image. You mentioned the tank man, and we've seen some other ones before. When there was the migrant crisis, there was suddenly this little boy found drowning on the beach, which actually not only documented history but changed it as well. Recently, I'm just back from New Zealand, the portrait of Jacinda Ardern with the veil on. I mean, what do you think? I mean, number one, when a photographer takes this picture, do you know, and how does it feel that maybe, yes, now you're writing history and possibly changing history as well, because the world perception of a crisis or the understanding can change? And what about this massive responsibility that one picture can hold in the writing and in the making of history? Is it something you think about?
Yes, I think single iconic image, the making of an iconic image, instead, in fact, it says more about how we do things in mass media. Because back in the days when traditional news outlet was doing well with their circulation and advertising, newspaper or magazine would spare no efforts to send their own writers and photographers to every single important event. But the result is that either it's New York Times or the Sunday Times or the Time and Newsweek, editors don't naturally said, I must use the pictures of my own photographers. even though, they have already commissioned the photographer to do that, and the photographer come back with the images. Editor would say, well, on this story, which is the best images that can help us tell the story? So these images could be from Sigma, or from Gamma, or from the AP, or from the Reuters. They just want the same pictures. So I would say in the golden days of traditional media, these pictures picked by editors across the world make their pictures iconic, because that's the image that everybody refer to. Either you are in France, you're looking at Paris Match, you are in Germany looking at the Stern magazine, or you're in America looking at Time magazine. So these images help us to build a collective memory of a story through an iconic image. But today, you rightly point out these young boys' pictures on the beach that precipitated the uproar about the refugee situation that has enormous implication and impact on Western Europe. Today is taken by a non-professional photographer. So we are in a whole new age. In 2017, more than 2.7 trillion images were dumped on Instagram. So that's a lot of pictures. But I noticed that last week the Guardian editor, Alan, spoke here. And I totally agree with his observation that we are only into this beginning of this digital transformation. We are only at 1.0. We don't know what changes may bring. But I believe that the idea of storytelling as well as storytelling are changing and changing rapidly.
Thank you very much. So now we have time for some questions from the floor. Please raise your hand, identify yourself, and put your question.
Hi, my name is Yatra. What? Hi, my name is Yachou. I'm from Human Rights Watch. I mean, a lot of my Chinese of my generation, they don't know the Tiananmen Square, the massacre, and they have not seen the pictures. And you took those iconic photos, and you had a lot of engagement with China, in the past 3 decades. Have you talked to young people? Do you mention that I took those pictures? I'm just wondering what's their reactions to those images.
In my entire professional life, I think writers hear back from readers more often than photographers do from people who look at our photographs. In 2008, when my book China Portrait of a Country was published by Taschen, that book took me 4 years to edit. I traveled across China. The idea was actually back in 2003, I believe. I was standing on the roof top of the Grand Hotel near Tiananmen Square, and Chinese were pouring into Tiananmen Square to celebrate. Beijing won the second bid to host the Summer Olympic. And at that time I thought, if all these people will be coming to visit Summer Olympic, how many truly understand the journey of New China? So I decided this idea is that let the Chinese photographers' work show what China was like in 60 years. So I find myself in a different circumstance like this lunch, but I was speaking to the Bristol Museum of Film and Television in UK, and as I spoke and showed the images, I noticed a Chinese student, a girl, was crying quietly, and I didn't want to make a fuss of it. And at the end, when it was all over, I was sitting there signing some books. So she came up to me. I said, "What happened?" She said, "Oh, your presentation, I was very moved because it confirmed, it gave me a visual information of what my parents were telling me about China." China, by the way, when my first book was published by Penguin in 1983, I asked the head of the Chinese Academy of Social Science, I said, "You know the history of China very well. Can you recount how many political campaigns there were in China since 1949? And the book I was preparing at that time, because I need to know to write an introduction to a foreword for my own book. So he counted and he counted, and he said, "Oh, we have 23 political campaigns." And I do the math. Basically, up until then, China had one political campaign a year. And I in the foreword, I said, Chinese people were exhausted. Look how many political campaigns there were. So I think when that book came out, and I know in China, there was no images. I looked as hard as I looked. There was few images would tell you of the Great Leap Forward. According even to the public security records, 40 to 43 million people were wiped out. But we don't have a photographic records of how that 大跃进, the Great Leap Forward, evolved, and how the people suffer. I was there because I saw my neighbors in Fuzhou. The neck was swollen, the face was blown up, their legs and the arms were all swollen from malnutrition. So, and moving fast forward to today, I mean, my publishers in Beijing, after 23 years, left that book, China Aftermath, with some pictures being censored, was finally published in China. And the publisher said to me, he said, in our study, a lot of people buy your book who were born after 90s. So this was something that I felt very good about it, that people can go back to this book and see those people, see what happened to China. And one thing, I know the time is short, one thing I wanted to emphasize, what photography do very, very well is that it describes. It just simply describes every image. It describes something that is something that adds to the weight of the words.
Well, I'm terribly sorry that. Oh, you have okay. A special question? Yes. Okay, from a photographer. So we will. Yes, we will go an extra minute for you.
Is this working?
Yes.
I'm a photographer with AFP here, and I've also just come back from New Zealand, where I was taking pictures, transferring them from my camera via Wi-Fi to my phone, and then sending them straight off to the desk. And you mentioned someone being a pigeon. I was wondering if you could tell me more about your process of getting those pictures out of Beijing for us all to see.
Do you mean 1989?
Yeah.
One of the first and only major decision I made when New York said you are in charge, I said to my colleagues and people in the office, because there were two phone lines that was assigned to photos, and the editors and bureau writers, they have other phones. The first thing I said to them is that at that time, I think the long distance call out of Beijing was 9 RMB per minute. And I said, nobody hang up the phone. No matter, we just don't hang up the phone. If we are not filing the pictures, we let it, let the phone stay idle, but we don't hang up the phone. So, because my feeling is that if I hang up the phone and I could never get back the signal, what do I do then? In our profession, editors around the world, they basically don't want to hear our story of why you don't have it. Because in Afghanistan it's the same thing. I arrive with my satellite phone, portable dark room, my camera, and so on and so forth. And I find out there was no electricity. So I ran down to the black market. I loaned a generator, a power generator, a Honda generator, and I realized, hey, I don't have gasoline to power this little power generator. So I went back down to the black market and tried to buy a can of diesels from the Russian soldiers, and came back and I said, gee, there's one more thing, because for this phone to work, if you want to use a satellite phone, you have to dish up, and the dish has to lock on to the satellite in Norway or in Indian Ocean. And I find we are on the second floor of Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul that Taliban agreed not to shell us. But still, we can't get to the top, so I have to go and scramble for the wires and reach and dish up on the roof so we can file pictures. And I remember those days when I'm the only one with a phone that works, and I'm the only one, power up. And all the writers with their laptops said, Liu, get off that phone, let us file our stories.
Thank you very much. And for more details about the Tankman, Anthony, we will host a special evening or event actually about the history of the Tankman as part of the events we will do for the anniversary of Tiananmen. Well, I'm terribly sorry we have to finish. We were saying with HS we should have hosted him at night so we could have gone for much longer. So many fascinating stories, but enormous thanks. It's really been a privilege to listen to you, and please join me in thanking very much Mr. Liu and Phil Tinari as well. Fantastic.